Elara stood on the edge of the property line, the deed clutched in a hand that had grown thin and pale over the preceding months. The paper was a brittle ghost of a thing, its legalese a formal, unfeeling monument to the end of a life, her mother's life. What it represented in the physical world was spread before her. 3 acres of sullen, uncooperative land in a part of the country where the wind was the primary crop and winter was the only reliable season. The ground was studded with granite knuckles and choked with wiry brown grass that seemed to have given up on the very idea of green. At its center, like a festering wound, lay the inheritance itself. It was not the land, not really. It was the pit, a waterlogged gash in the earth, roughly 50 feet across, left behind by some long-forgotten quarrying effort. The water within it was a sheet of stagnant black glass, reflecting the bruised pewter of the autumn sky with a kind of cynical perfection. The air carried the scent of cold stone and damp decay, a premonition of the snow that was already gathering its forces in the gray bellies of the clouds to the north. Elara drew her mother's old woolen coat tighter around her frame. It was too large, a constant tactile reminder of the woman who was gone, of the warmth that had been extinguished. She was 24 years old, and the world had contracted to this single, desolate point. The small savings she had were nearly gone, bled away by the quiet, mundane costs of a prolonged illness and a simple burial. She had no other family to speak of save for an uncle who viewed her existence as an administrative inconvenience. This land, this pit, was the sum total of her worldly possessions. It was a joke without a punchline, a legacy of absence. Her uncle Silas had made his opinion clear in the solicitor's cramped, dusty office. He was a man built of hard angles and harder certainties, his face a permanent mask of disapproval. He had looked at the deed, then at her, and had produced a sound that was not quite a laugh but held all of its dismissive power. A flooded quarry pit, he'd said, his voice dry as rustling leaves. What in God's name is a girl like you going to do with a flooded quarry pit? Sell it. I'll give you $100 for the trouble of taking it off your hands. It's a liability, Elara, a place for foolish children to drown. His offer was an insult wrapped in the guise of paternal concern, and she had recognized it for what it was. The predatory circling of a man who smelled weakness. He wanted the granite, she knew. He ran a small construction business in the town a few miles away and could likely crush the rock for gravel, turning a tidy profit from her misfortune. She had refused. The word had been quiet, barely a whisper in that stuffy room, but it had landed with the force of a slammed door. Silas's eyes, small and dark like chips of flint, had narrowed. "Don't be a fool," he'd snapped, his thin veneer of patience cracking. "Pride is a luxury, girl. It won't keep you warm when the first snow flies, and it will fly soon." His words were meant to be a prophecy, a curse. They followed her now, clinging to the cold air, whispering from the skeletal branches of the few stunted birches that bordered the property. He was not wrong about the coming winter. It was a palpable presence, a predator stalking the edges of the year. The townspeople she had encountered echoed his sentiment in their own ways, with glances of pity and muttered condolences that felt more like judgments. The poor Reed girl left with nothing but her mother's folly. That land never gave anything but trouble. Elara walked the perimeter of the pit, her worn boots sinking slightly into the soft, damp earth at its lip. The water was unnaturally still. No life stirred within its depths. No insects danced on its surface. It was a place of profound inertia. Her mother had bought this land years ago, a decision no one in the family had ever understood. She had spoken of building a small house, of having a garden, of finding a quiet place away from the world's noise. But illness had crept in like a slow tide, eroding her plans and her strength until all that remained was the dream and this water-filled hole? Ilara remembered her mother tracing the property lines on a map with a hopeful finger, her voice filled with a conviction that seemed, in retrospect, tragically misplaced. "There's a secret in that land, Ellie," she used to say. "The earth remembers. It holds its warmth deep down." At the time, they had sounded like the gentle ramblings of a woman clinging to poetry in a world of hard prose. Now, standing on the precipice of a brutal winter, with nothing but those cryptic words for comfort, Ilara felt a despair so vast and empty it mirrored the sky above. The first few days were a blur of grim, methodical labor. She used the last of her money to buy a few essential supplies in town: a sturdy hand-cranked siphon pump, several lengths of canvas hose, a new handle for a shovel whose head she'd found in the leaning shed at the back of the property, and sacks of oats and dried beans that would have to last her indefinitely. The man at the hardware store, Arthur Croft, had watched her pile the items on the counter, his brow furrowed with a kind of weary concern. He was a farmer whose land bordered hers, a man with hands like worn leather and a face mapped with the lines of countless seasons. He had known her mother, had shared a fence line with her for a decade. "Planning on doing some plumbing?" he'd asked, his voice a low, rumbling sound. "Something like that," Ilara had replied, unwilling to offer any more, unwilling to invite the pity she saw waiting in his eyes. He rang up the sale, his movements slow and deliberate. "That's a tough piece of ground your mother left you," he said, not looking at her. "The water table is high, fills up as fast as you can empty it." It was meant as a piece of practical advice, but it felt like another nail being hammered into the coffin of her hope. She set up a meager camp in the dilapidated shed, a structure that argued constantly with the wind. It offered little more than a psychological barrier against the elements, but it was a space that was hers. Her first task was the pit. The problem was simple and immense. She had to get the water out. She assembled the siphon pump at the lowest edge of the pit's lip, running the outflow hose down the gentle slope of the land toward a dry creek bed 100 yards away. The mechanics were straightforward, but the work was punishing. The pump handle was stiff and unforgiving. It demanded a rhythm of push and pull, a mindless, repetitive motion that engaged every muscle in her back and shoulders. For the first hour, nothing happened. There was only the gurgle and slosh of water inside the pump's mechanism, a frustrating sound of effort without result. She felt a familiar sting behind her eyes, the burn of imminent tears. This was folly. Silas was right. Arthur Croft was right. The whole town was right. She stopped, resting her forehead against the cold metal of the pump handle, her breath coming in ragged clouds. The wind whipped a strand of her hair across her face. She thought of her mother's hands, how they had been so gentle yet possessed a surprising strength. She thought of those words, "The earth remembers." It was a foolish, desperate mantra, but it was all she had. With a grunt of frustration that was half a sob, she leaned into the handle again, putting her entire weight into it, her body a simple lever. And then something shifted, a new sound, a deep, resonant sucking from the intake hose, submerged in the pit. A moment later, a hesitant trickle of dark, tea-colored water sputtered from the end of the outflow hose. It was a pathetic stream, but it was a start. It was a victory. She began to pump again, this time with a renewed, almost savage determination. The trickle became a steady flow, a dark tongue of water licking its way down the slope. For the next week, the pump became the center of her universe. She worked from the first gray light of dawn until her arms screamed with fatigue and the dusk bled all the color from the sky. Her hands, soft from a life spent mostly indoors, quickly blistered, then bled, then hardened into clumsy calluses. The water level in the pit dropped with agonizing slowness, an inch or two a day. It was a geological time scale of progress. Every morning she would wake with a knot of dread in her stomach, convinced the pit would have refilled overnight, that Arthur Croft's warning about the water table had come to pass. But each day the dark stain on the granite walls was a little lower. The pit was slowly, reluctantly revealing its secrets. As the water receded, the shape of the place began to emerge. It was not a simple bowl, as she had imagined. The granite walls were sheer on one side, a vertical face of gray, white, and black stone that rose nearly 20 feet. The other side was a series of massive stepped ledges like the seating in a Roman amphitheater. The floor was not mud, but a jumble of smaller boulders and gravel, washed clean by decades of sitting water. It was a place of stark geometric beauty, a hidden piece of architecture carved by man and then abandoned to nature. Silas saw only a hole to be filled or exploited. The townsfolk saw a dangerous nuisance. But as Alara pumped, day after agonizing day, she began to see something else. She began to see a structure. She saw walls. She saw a floor. She saw shelter. One afternoon, as she paused to rub the ache from her lower back, Arthur Croft's truck rattled to a stop on the dirt track that passed for a road. He got out and walked toward her, his stride unhurried. He carried a small thermos. He did not comment on the pump or the slowly draining pit. He simply stood beside her for a moment, watching the stream of water flowing down the hill. "Cold front moving in tonight," he said, his gaze fixed on the northern horizon. He unscrewed the cup from his thermos and poured a steaming, fragrant liquid into it. "Coffee. You look like you could use some." She took it without a word, her calloused fingers wrapping around the warmth of the plastic cup. The heat seeped into her bones, a small, profound comfort. "I'm not trying to tell you your business," he said, finally looking at the pit. "But that hole has a way of drinking the rain. Come spring melt, it'll be full again." "I know," she said, her voice hoarse from disuse. He nodded slowly, as if her answer was all he needed to hear. He seemed to be measuring her, not with judgment, but with a kind of cautious curiosity. He looked at her hands, at the raw red knuckles, and a flicker of something, respect perhaps, passed through his eyes. "Well," he said, turning to leave, "don't work past dark. The coyotes get bold this time of year." He drove away, leaving her with the warmth of the coffee and the echo of his practical, understated concern. He had not offered help, but he had not offered scorn either. In her profound isolation, it felt like a gesture of immense kindness. He was the skeptical ally, though she did not yet know it. He saw the madness of her endeavor, but he could not deny the evidence of her labor. The day the pump finally began to suck air was a day of quiet, bone-deep triumph. The floor of the quarry was exposed, a damp, rocky basin littered with the debris of years. A thick layer of black, nutrient-rich silt covered the gravel in the lowest spots. The air in the pit was different, still and silent, shielded from the constant nagging of the wind. It was also noticeably warmer. Standing on the bottommost ledge, Alara could feel the absence of the breeze that chilled her to the marrow on the surface. She pressed a bare hand against the sheer granite wall. It was cool, but not with the biting cold of the air. It was the deep, neutral coolness of the earth itself, a stable temperature that hinted at a vast thermal reservoir within the rock. She remembered her mother's words again, but this time they were not a poetic fragment. They were a blueprint. The earth holds its warmth deep down. Her mother hadn't been a geologist or an engineer, but she had been a gardener, a woman who understood the rhythms of the soil. She had understood that just a few feet below the surface, the earth maintained a near constant temperature, insulated from the wild swings of the seasons. Below the frost line, the ground was a sanctuary. Most people saw this land as a surface, something to be built upon. Her mother, and now Alara, had begun to see its potential in 3 dimensions. The pit was not a hole. It was a vessel, It was a shield. The idea began to form, not as a sudden flash of lightning, but as a slow, dawning realization, pieced together from desperation, memory, and direct observation. She would not build on the land. She would build in it. She envisioned a structure nestled against the sheer rock face, using the granite wall as its back support. It would be a long, narrow building, a kind of lean-to, but recessed into the earth. The roof would be angled steeply, designed to be covered with a thick layer of soil and sod, creating a living blanket of insulation. The front, facing the stepped ledges, would be a wall of glass, or what passed for glass in her budget. She would harvest the smooth, flat stones from the quarry floor to build the side walls and use the silt and clay from the bottom to chink the gaps. It would be a house half born of the earth, a subterranean greenhouse, a place to survive the winter not by fighting the cold, but by hiding from it. The plan was audacious, born of a profound and terrifying necessity. It was a rejection of every conventional notion of home and shelter in this part of the country, where houses were sturdy wooden boxes built to brace themselves against the wind, their furnaces roaring in defiance of the cold. Her design was one of cooperation, not defiance. It was the logic of a burrowing animal, of a root cellar, of life finding a way to persist in the harshest of conditions. She sketched the design on the back of the deed with a piece of charcoal from her small fire, the lines rough and inexpert, but the concept clear and strong in her mind. This was her inheritance, not the flooded pit, but the insight it had been waiting to reveal. Now the true labor began. Draining the pit had been a battle of endurance. Building the shelter was a contest of ingenuity and brute force. She became a scavenger, a mason, a carpenter of the most primitive sort. The leaning shed yielded a few treasures, a rusty pry bar, a half-full box of bent nails which she painstakingly straightened one by one, and a tattered canvas tarpaulin. She used the pry bar to work the smaller, flatter stones free from the quarry floor, her muscles straining with the effort. Each stone was a small victory. She learned to read the rock, to see the fracture lines, to use the leverage of the bar to its best effect. She stacked the stones to form the two short end walls of her planned structure, a slow, painstaking process. She had no mortar, so she used the thick, clay-like silt from the bottom of the pit, mixing it with dry grass to act as a binder. It was an ancient technique, one she hadn't read in any book but seemed to discover through instinct. Her days fell into a grueling rhythm. In the morning she would haul stone, her body a simple machine of lifting and carrying. In the afternoon she would mix her earthen mortar and carefully set the stones, filling the gaps, her hands constantly caked in mud. The walls rose with the slowness of a growing tree, a few inches each day. The work was isolating, a silent communion between herself, the stone, and the encroaching cold. The sky was a constant reminder of her deadline. The clouds grew heavier, the wind sharper. The sun, when it appeared, was a pale, watery disk that offered little warmth. Silas came to visit once during this period. He drove his large, new truck right to the edge of the pit and got out, his arms crossed over his chest. He looked down at her, a small, mud-streaked figure toiling at the bottom of the great stone bowl. His face was a mixture of disbelief and contempt. "What in the name of all that is holy are you doing?" he called down, his voice echoing slightly against the rock walls. "Building a tomb for yourself?" She did not stop her work. She picked up another stone and carefully placed it on the wall. "I'm building a house," she answered, her voice flat and even. He let out that dry, barking laugh again. "A house? That's a mud hut, Ilara. You're playing in the dirt like a child. Sell me the land before you get yourself killed. I'll raise my offer, $200. For God's sake, have some sense." Her refusal this time was her silence. She simply continued to work, her movements deliberate, her focus absolute. Her dismissal of him was so complete that it enraged him. "You'll be begging me for shelter when the first blizzard hits," he shouted, his voice tight with anger. "You'll come knocking on my door, frozen and starved, and you'll remember this day. You'll remember that I tried to help you." He got back in his truck and spun the wheels in the dirt as he drove away, leaving behind the smell of exhaust and his toxic certainty. His visit, meant to intimidate her, had the opposite effect. It hardened her resolve. His vision of her failure became a powerful motivator. She would not freeze. She would not starve. She would not go knocking on his door. Arthur Croft continued his occasional quiet visits. He never came down into the pit, but he would stand at the edge and observe her progress. He asked practical questions. "How are you planning for the roof? What about a chimney?" His skepticism was still there, but it was now tempered with a grudging admiration for her sheer tenacity. One afternoon he arrived not with coffee but with a load of old lumber in the back of his truck. "Old joists from a barn I tore down," he said, by way of explanation. "They're seasoned oak, stronger than anything you could buy new." He also brought a box of thick, translucent plastic sheeting. "My wife used this for her cold frames. Got a few tears in it, but it'll hold out the wind." He helped her unload the materials, his powerful arms making light work of the heavy beams. He still did not fully believe in her vision, but he was a practical man who could not stand to see wasted effort. If she was going to build this mad thing, she might as well build it with a roof that wouldn't collapse on her. His contribution was a turning point. It was the first time someone had offered her help instead of scorn. It was a beam of light in her solitary world. With the oak joists, she constructed the framework for the roof, angling it from the top of her short stone walls down to the granite face of the quarry. It was the most difficult part of the construction, a dangerous puzzle of lifting and securing the heavy beams by herself. She used a system of levers and ropes, her body aching with the unfamiliar strain. Once the frame was in place, she stretched the heavy plastic sheeting over it, creating the transparent front wall of her shelter. It was not glass, but it would let in the precious winter sunlight. Finally, she laid the old canvas tarpaulin over the roof joists and then began the final crucial step. Bucket by bucket, she hauled soil and sod from the surface and spread it over the roof, creating a thick, insulating layer of earth. She transplanted the tough, wiry grass onto the roof, hoping its roots would help hold the soil in place. When she was finished, her shelter was almost invisible from the surface, a gentle green mound rising from the floor of the pit. From the inside, it was a long, narrow cave of stone and earth, with one wall that was a sheet of pale, milky light. The final piece was the stove. She built it herself out of a rusted oil drum Silas had left to rot on the property and some sections of metal pipe Arthur had given her. It was a crude, ugly thing, but it drew air and could hold a fire. She ran the chimney pipe up through a carefully sealed hole in the earthen roof. With the last of her energy, she moved her few possessions inside. Her sleeping bag, the sacks of oats and beans, her mother's old books. The interior smelled of damp earth, stone, and curing clay. It was not a house. It was a burrow. It was a womb. It was home. She finished just in time. The very next day the weather turned. The sky, which had been threatening for weeks, finally made good on its promise. The temperature plummeted and the wind began to howl, a low, mournful sound that seemed to rise from the very bones of the earth. The first flakes of snow began to fall, not gently, but in a furious horizontal assault. Alara stood for a moment at the entrance to her shelter, watching the world disappear into a churning vortex of white. Then she retreated inside, pulling a heavy door made from the last of Arthur's barn wood closed behind her. The silence inside was absolute. The roar of the wind, the shrieking of the blizzard, was gone. It was replaced by a profound, muffled stillness. The 20 feet of earth and rock that surrounded her on 3 sides was a perfect sound barrier. She lit a small fire in the oil drum stove. The metal ticked and pinged as it warmed, and soon a gentle, radiant heat began to fill the small space. The temperature inside her shelter, which had been hovering just above freezing, began to climb. She sat on her sleeping bag, watching the fire, listening to the silence. A sense of peace, so long absent it felt like a foreign emotion, settled over her. She was safe. She was warm. The blizzard raged for 3 days. The locals would later call it the White Death of '78, a storm of legendary ferocity that buried houses, stranded livestock, and brought the entire region to a frozen standstill. The power lines went down on the first night, plunging the town and the surrounding farms into darkness and cold. For those who relied on electric heat, it was a desperate situation. For those with wood stoves, it became a battle of attrition, a constant feeding of the fire against a cold that seemed to seep through the very walls of their well-built, conventional homes. Silas, in his large, modern house, found himself in a precarious position. His generator failed after the first day, and his supply of firewood, which he had considered ample, began to dwindle at an alarming rate. The cold invaded his home, creeping in around the window frames and under the doors. On the second day, he found himself huddled in a single room with his family, wrapped in every blanket they owned, feeding the last of his wood into the fireplace, watching the flames with a growing sense of dread. He thought of Alara, out in her mud pit. He imagined her frozen, a tragic, stubborn fool buried under a mountain of snow. A part of him felt a grim satisfaction. He had warned her. But another, smaller part felt a prickle of unease, a sliver of guilt that he quickly suppressed. Arthur Croft was better prepared than most. His old farmhouse was drafty, but his woodpile was the size of a small cottage. Still, the sheer, unrelenting violence of the storm worried him. The cold was of a different quality, a piercing, invasive cold that no amount of fire seemed to fully repel. On the third day, during a brief lull in the wind, he found himself thinking of Alara. He pictured her in that flimsy shed, or worse, in that half-buried contraption of hers. He imagined the earthen roof collapsing under the immense weight of the snow. The thought gnawed at him. He had helped her, had given her the beams for that roof. If it failed, he would feel a share of the responsibility. Cursing himself for a sentimental old fool, he pulled on his heaviest coat, wrapped his face in a scarf, and ventured out into the storm. The journey to her property was a brutal struggle. The snow was waist-deep in places, the wind a physical force that stole his breath and burned his exposed skin. It took him nearly an hour to cover the few hundred yards to the edge of her land. When he finally reached the quarry, he stopped, his heart sinking. The entire landscape was an undifferentiated sea of white. The pit was gone, filled to the brim with snow, vanished as if it had never existed. He could see no sign of her shelter, no wisp of smoke from a chimney. He saw only a smooth, pristine blanket of snow. He was too late. The stubborn girl had finally met the consequence of her folly. He felt a profound, hollow ache of regret. He stood there for a long moment, a solitary figure in the vast, white emptiness, about to turn back. And then he saw it. A faint, almost imperceptible anomaly in the snow. It was a small, circular patch, no more than 2 feet in diameter, where the snow was not piled deep, but seemed to have melted away, revealing the dark soil beneath. From the center of this patch, a thin, almost invisible plume of heat shimmered in the frigid air. It was the top of her chimney stack. She was down there. She was alive. Driven by a new sense of urgency, he floundered his way to the spot where he knew the entrance to her shelter must be. He began to dig with his gloved hands, clawing at the heavy, packed snow. After a few minutes of frantic work, His fingers struck wood. It was the top of her door. He cleared more snow away, his breath coming in ragged, steaming bursts. He pounded on the door with his fist. "Alara!" he shouted, his voice hoarse against the wind. "Alara, are you in there?" The door creaked open a few inches, revealing a sliver of warm yellow light. Alara peered out, her face framed by the soft glow. She was not frostbitten or starving. She was calm, her cheeks flushed with warmth. She looked surprised to see him. "Arthur, what are you doing out in this? Come in, quickly." She opened the door wider and he stumbled inside, bringing a swirl of snow and frigid air with him. The contrast between the outside world and the interior of her shelter was so profound it was disorienting. The air was warm, not just tolerably so, but genuinely comfortably warm. The small stove glowed with a low, steady fire, consuming a surprisingly small log. The light came from a single lantern, its flame reflecting off the plastic sheeting wall, which was now covered in a thick, insulating blanket of snow. But the most astonishing thing was the green. Along the back granite wall, on a series of small shelves she had built, were dozens of small pots and trays, and in them, growing in the warm, humid air, were the vibrant green shoots of lettuce, spinach, and herbs. She had created an underground summer in the heart of the White Death. Arthur stood in stunned silence, dripping melted snow onto the packed earth floor. He looked from the thriving plants to the small, efficient stove, to Alara's calm, composed face. He had come out here expecting to find a tragedy, a frozen monument to foolish pride. Instead, he had found a miracle of quiet, practical ingenuity. He had witnessed the complete and undeniable vindication of her seemingly insane plan. "How?" was all he could manage to say, the word, a puff of white vapor in the warm air. "The earth," she said simply, a small, knowing smile on her lips. "It holds the warmth." He slowly unbuttoned his coat, the reality of what she had accomplished settling over him. The stone walls of the quarry, the thick earthen roof, the insulating blanket of snow. It was a system of perfect, passive efficiency. She was not fighting the winter. She was using it. The snow that had buried and threatened everyone else was her final, most effective layer of insulation. He looked at her, this quiet, stubborn young woman who had been dismissed by everyone as a fool, and he felt a wave of awe. He finally understood. She wasn't mad. She was a genius. "I'll be damned," he whispered, shaking his head in disbelief. "I'll be damned." The deal was done. The skeptic had become the first true believer. When the storm finally broke and the plows cleared the roads, the stories began to circulate. Stories of collapsed roofs, of livestock lost, of families who had come perilously close to freezing in their own homes. Silas's story was among them. He had lost a portion of his own roof under the weight of the snow and had spent a small fortune on emergency repairs. A week after the blizzard, a subdued and humbled Arthur Croft drove his tractor to Alara's property, a plow blade fixed to the front. He methodically cleared a path to her shelter and then, without being asked, cleared the heavy snow from her earthen roof, his movements careful and precise. Word of Alara's survival and the manner of it spread through the community like wildfire carried by Arthur himself. He described what he had seen with the plain, unadorned language of a farmer, which gave the tale an unshakable veracity. He spoke of the warmth, the silence, and most of all, the green, growing things. People were incredulous at first, then curious. They began to visit, first in trickles, then in small groups. They would stand at the edge of the pit, which Alara and Arthur had now cleared, and peer down at the strange, half-buried structure. She would invite them in, and they would file into the narrow, warm space, their eyes wide with wonder. They touched the stone wall, felt the radiant heat from the small stove, and stared at the impossible rows of winter lettuce. The Fool's Pit, as it had been derisively known, was rechristened. People started calling it the Winter Garden. The Mad Woman became the Woman of the Pit, a title that was spoken not with mockery, but with a deep and profound respect. Silas was one of the last to visit. He came alone on a bitter, cold afternoon. He did not drive up in his big truck, but walked from the road, his shoulders hunched against the wind. He stood at the entrance for a long time before she noticed him. She did not gloat. She did not say, "I told you so." She simply held the door open for him. He stepped inside, his eyes taking in the same scene that had stunned Arthur. He saw the proof of his error, the undeniable success of the idea he had so viciously scorned. He looked at his niece, at the quiet strength in her face, and for the first time he saw not a foolish girl, but a woman of formidable will and vision. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet space. "I was wrong," he said. The words were hard for him, like stones he had to cough up. That's all he said. He turned and left. But the admission hung in the warm air, a final, complete surrender. That spring, 3 different families approached Alara asking for her help. They were farmers who had lost greenhouses in the blizzard, their fragile glass structures shattered by the weight of the snow. They wanted to build their own winter gardens. With Arthur's help, she drew up proper plans. They found that her design was not just for survival, it was a model of efficiency. The pit houses, as they came to be called, required a fraction of the firewood of a conventional home and could produce fresh food throughout the year. They were a perfect solution for a land of harsh winters and resilient people. Alara Reed, the destitute orphan with the worthless inheritance, became an architect of survival, a founder of a new way of living in the North Country. She never grew rich, but she was never cold or hungry again. She lived out her days on that small plot of land, in the warm embrace of the earth, secure in the knowledge she had listened to a wisdom that others had been deaf to. Decades later, if you were to travel through that part of the country, you would see them. The gentle grass-covered mounds, often built into the south-facing slopes of hills, their angled glass faces glinting in the sun. The pit houses became a signature of the region's architecture, a testament to a lesson learned in the crucible of a legendary storm. The original Winter Garden is still there, maintained by the Historical Society. School children are taken on tours to see the place where it all began. They are told the story of the young woman who was left with nothing but a flooded hole in the ground. They are told how everyone laughed at her, how they called her a fool for trying to empty it. And they are told how she found in the cold, silent depths of the earth not just a way to survive a single brutal winter, but a new way for a whole community to thrive. The story is a reminder, passed down through generations, that the most profound wisdom is often found not in shouting defiance at the world, but in listening carefully to its quietest whispers. It is a lesson about the immense value hidden in the places people have discarded, and the remarkable power of one person's courage to look foolish in the pursuit of a better way.